Test. There we go. All right, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation. My name's Hank Brady. I am the implementation manager for CalRecycle for SB1383. I have a couple housekeeping items regarding the room to announce. So for phones, politely ask people to turn off their phones to silent or vibrate mode. For restroom locations, restrooms are located down the hallway across from the auditorium entrance. Regarding emergencies, in the event of emergency, occupants may need to shelter in place or evacuate the building. If an evacuation isn't called, please exit the building through the exit doors at the back of the auditorium. And if a shelter in place is necessary, such as in the event of an earthquake, please drop, cover your head, and hold on to your chair. Okay, so again, my name is Hank Brady. Be giving an overview presentation today for our folks participating online. We do have the slcp.organics inbox there pulled up on the screen, and we have about 400, 500, 600 people here in attendance to give you a sense of what the room is like. I guess that one didn't really land there. Before we get started, I want to thank the AQMD for hosting us again. They've hosted a number of CalRecycle functions, including our public meeting today. I do also want to thank everyone that's participating here today, as well as folks that have submitted comments during the formal rulemaking process, as well as the informal process that we held in 2017 and 2018. All of those comments have helped us improve the quality and substance of the regulations, and I think as we're going through the revisions today, you'll see a lot of the comments made in the 45-day comment process have resulted in changes to the regulatory text that we originally submitted. And also want to thank some of our colleagues in CalRecycle staff that are not here today. We have a smaller crew presenting today. It will mostly be me doing a run-through, and then we'll have an opportunity for clarifying questions before the comment period starts tomorrow. But there's a lot of staff that's involved really from the get-go, with about 260 letters that we got in the formal 45-day rulemaking process that was divided into around 2,500 individual comments. And there's a crew of people that are led by Gwen Huff. Gwen, if you want to raise your hand. So they are dividing about 260 letters into 2,500 individual comments, and that's actually going through PDFs, pulling out things to make sure that we're capturing every comment that's received and either making a change or responding, explaining our thinking in response to that comment. And there's also our colleagues that have worked on the various policy aspects of the regulation, such as specific sections relative to procurement and food, that are monitoring this today, and will probably let me know where I screw up on explaining their sections. But they'll also be listening in as folks have questions relative to their sections, and there's a number of folks in that category. So today, coming back to the slides for the overview today, I'm going to close this. Sorry. Just going to give an overview of our timeline so far and what we're covering today. The informal draft regulatory text was posted as part of an RFA before we submitted it to the Office of Administrative Law back in December of 2018. That was formally noticed in January of this year, with the public comment period running from January 18 to March 4th. And then, as many of you know and participated in, we had a formal hearing on March 12th to hear and receive comments on the first draft of regulatory text. Today, this is not a formal hearing, but we are presenting on the changes that we've made. Our purpose today is really to provide an overview, a broad overview of the key changes in the second draft compared to the first draft, so that folks have context and a little insight on our thinking about the changes that we made and why before the formal 15-day comment period starts. And it's also so that we can answer clarifying questions to help folks guide their comments during the 15-day formal comment period. That comment period will start tomorrow, Wednesday the 19th, and run through July 3rd, 2019. For a preview of next steps for 1383, we've been working with a contractor on the draft environmental impact report and are planning to have that draft EIR posted July 30th. And that will be formally noticed, and then we will have a formal hearing to take comments on the draft EIR. We're looking at a date in August. That time will be solidified very soon. And then we do plan to have a third formal draft of text, both in response to comments that we received during the 15-day comment period, as well as final corrections on language that we may have missed in this draft. So with that, going to dive right in, not providing a full overview of the regs. I think folks participating at this point have a good sense of the direction and why we're doing this. I'm just going to provide a brief intro on the high-level statutory requirements and then dive into the changes going article by article through the text. So as folks know, the purpose of SB1383 is to reduce the disposal of organic waste that's currently going to landfills. We estimate that based on the current disposal projections, as well as the 2014 Waste Characterization Study baseline, that approximately 20 to 23 million tons of organic waste is disposed annually, and that by 2025, anywhere in the range of 20 to 25 million tons will need to be reduced in order for us to achieve the SB 1383 organic waste reduction targets. Those categories of organic waste are broken down on the pie chart on the table. You can see the largest individual category is food waste, and that does have a large impact on why the legislature directed us to focus in these regulations on implementing actions to increase the recovery of edible food that's currently disposed. Specifically, before diving into the regulatory requirements, just a refresher for everyone, the targets for SB 1383 are that by 2020, the state needs to reduce landfill disposal of organic waste by 50%, and that's 50% from the 2014 baseline, meaning that the organic waste disposal needs to exceed no more than 11.5 million tons by 2020. By 2025, that target increases to 75%, again tied to the 2014 baseline, meaning that organic waste disposal needs to be less than 5.7 million tons on an annual basis. And as population and generation of organic waste continues to grow, that will require an increasing amount of organic waste that has to be recovered on an annual basis. And then finally, as I mentioned, the 2025 target as a part of the 75% organic waste reduction target is to increase recovery of currently disposed edible food by 20% by 2025. And all of that is with the regulations that we are discussing today and that we will have adopted by the end of this year or early 2020 to take effect in 2022. So with that, I'm going to dive right into the changes to the regulatory text. Skipping over Article 1, there are a number of changes to definitions that were made, but those definitional changes are really related to the policy changes that are made in the subsequent articles and will be covered as we go through each article. So as it relates to Article 2 in Section 1, we've clarified that the use of non-organic material as landfill cover does not constitute disposal of organic waste. And we've also amended language in that section relative to the use of material recovery fines as alternative daily cover or alternative intermediate cover. The previous draft specified that use of that material does not constitute disposal of organic waste. Based on information that we've received during the formal rulemaking process, we felt the need to amend that to specify that if the material recovery fines through the normal approval process with the EA and concurrence by the department can demonstrate that the material recovery fines are free of organic waste, in that case, then they would be considered not disposal of organic waste. But until such a determination can be made, we can't definitively say that the material is not disposal of organic waste. For Section 2, there's a number of revisions in this section. The primary changes are that we have clarified timelines for ARB and CalRecycle, and we've clarified roles in the review process, specifically in response to stakeholder comments. We've added a timeline of 180 days for the department in consultation with the Executive Office of the Air Resources Board to respond to a complete application, seeking a determination of their technology and whether it constitutes a reduction in landfill disposal. And we've clarified that while the department consults with the Executive Office of the Air Resources Board, the final decision will ultimately be approved by the department. So regarding organic waste collection services, there's a number of changes that are made specifically to each type of service, either 3-container, 2-container, or 1-container, and there are a number of changes that apply to regardless of the service type that's provided. So the main changes in Article 3 that apply throughout are that we have delayed the container color standardization date to 2036. This was previously a requirement that all containers provided need to meet the color standardization by 2032. That is a change we've made in response to feedback from stakeholders, primarily jurisdictions, on that requesting additional time. Additionally, in response to comments, we have added provisions relative to the collection of compostable plastics with organic waste, and added provisions relative to the use of plastic bags for the collection of organic waste in organic waste collection containers. Relative to compostable plastics, we specified that those may be collected in the green container with organic waste, provided that the jurisdiction has received written certification from the facility processing their organic waste, demonstrating that the facility can process and recover those compostable plastics. Similarly with plastic bags, a written certification is required from the processing facility, demonstrating that the processor can remove plastic bags as a contaminant in its process for recovering organic waste. Additionally, we've added provisions relative to street collection of uncontainerized organic waste is the term that we're using. This is essentially for large green waste collection services, particularly seasonal services where green material is not collected in a container. The previous draft didn't have any provisions relative to allowing or disallowing for this material, so we've added provisions to clarify when those services can be provided. Specific to 3-container organic waste collection services, we have revised the color standardization for containers or sections of containers for source separation beyond 3-container service, specifically in response to stakeholder comments where if a 4th container or a 4th section of a split container was provided for food, that was previously required to be a yellow container. That has now been amended to require that to be a brown container, and that is in response to a number of comments from jurisdictions. And we've also added clarity for if additional source separation is provided beyond 4, 5, or 6, the types of container colors that can be used in those circumstances. And with the 2-container organic waste collection services, we have revised and clarified for those services that the containers that are provided can be a green and gray container, where a green container is for source separated organic waste. That is required to go to a source separated organic waste facility, and the gray container would be for all other material and be transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. Or the alternative version of a 2-container organic waste collection system would be a blue and gray container, where a blue container would be for traditional recyclables and certain categories of organic waste such as paper, cardboard, and lumber, and the gray container would be for all other material. In that case, the gray container would still need to go to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. For container contamination minimization requirements in Article 3, we've reduced the route review frequency from quarterly to annually. And we have also added new provisions authorizing a jurisdiction to meet its contamination monitoring requirements through a facility-based monitoring program where a waste composition study is performed at the facility to evaluate contamination in a manner that can be linked back to routes that are collected and sampled and result in education if contamination is detected through that method. The waste composition studies are performed in individual quarters throughout the year, and there's more specification in the regulatory requirements for that. Skipping a little bit out of order, but keeping with the theme of organic waste collection services, in response to a number of stakeholder comments requesting more flexibility for the provision of different types of services, particularly source-separated organic waste services. We have added a new article. This is Article 17, which is relative to performance-based source-separated organic waste collection services. Essentially, this article allows for a jurisdiction to implement a system where if they meet the minimum requirements, they would have compliance exemptions from a number of other aspects of the regulation. So the performance-based standards that a system would need to meet is that it would need to be a 3-container organic waste collection service where organic waste is source separated into a green and or blue container with a gray container for disposal. That service would need to be provided to 90% of generators that are subject to the jurisdiction's authority. The service would need to transport all source-separated organic waste to a source-separated organic waste recovery facility that recovers 75% of the organic content that the facility receives. The service would need to demonstrate that less than 25% of the content of the gray container, so the disposal container, less than 25% of the content in that container is organic waste. And when we speak about the solid waste facility standards in a moment, they'll understand how that calculation is arrived at. And then the service also needs to automatically enroll new residents and businesses in organic waste collection service, meaning that the service cannot be provided on an as requested basis, that it has to be provided through automatic enrollment. The first section of the performance-based source-separated collection service article also includes methods for a jurisdiction to demonstrate compliance and specifies the potential penalties for noncompliance and disqualifying circumstances, essentially when a jurisdiction would be deemed to have not met its 75% recovery deemed to have not been using a facility that recovers 75% or having more than 25% organic waste in the gray container. Specifically, the timelines are specified in that section. And then there are a number of compliance exemptions that a jurisdiction that meets these requirements would be eligible for. Specifically, the contamination monitoring requirements in Article 3 would not apply to jurisdictions implementing this type of service. The ongoing case-by-case issuance of waivers would not apply to a jurisdiction implementing this service because they're only required to provide service to 90% of their generators, so they would not have to have a case-by-case approval for de minimis collection, things of that nature. Jurisdictions would not be required to provide annual education and outreach for organic waste collection. They are not subject to the Article 7 regulation of hauler requirements. And primarily, they would also be exempt from the enforcement requirements that are in Article 14, as well as the penalty requirements for jurisdictions to impose that are in Article 17. So the intent of this new article is to provide an opportunity for substantial relief from some of the specific regulatory requirements if a jurisdiction is able to demonstrate that the service they're implementing meets minimum requirements. And finally, there are two other sections of this article that specify timelines and information that a jurisdiction must provide if they're going to opt into performing this system. And then there's a record-keeping section in this article that specifies the record keeping in the remainder of Chapter 12 that is still applicable. These jurisdictions would still need to meet other requirements such as implementing an edible food recovery program and a procurement program, so some of those record keeping requirements and reporting would still apply. And then there's record keeping requirements that are still applicable or that are new for this section. So with that, and to give everyone a break from me talking for a little bit, our executive fellow, Kieran, has worked with our staff on some of the expansions to the exemptions, as well as the revisions to the education and outreach requirements. So I'm going to hand it over to her to present on the next two slides.
Thanks, Hank. So as Hank mentioned, I'm going to talk briefly about changes made to the waivers and emergency circumstances based in response to comments received during the 45-day comment period. So firstly, for the low population waiver, thresholds were increased in response to comments. So for incorporated cities, the total population changed from less than 5,000 people to less than 7,500 people, still in conjunction with the 5,000 tons. And then census tracts in unincorporated county, the population density changed from 50 people per square mile to 75 people per square mile. And these changes do not significantly impact the amount of organic waste diversion, as it only increases the total organic waste waived by 0.47%. And then in response to a couple of some jurisdictional comments, we added an elevation waiver. So jurisdictions may apply to waive some or all of its generators from certain aspects of the organic waste separation and collection if an unincorporated city or census tracts of an unincorporated county are located at or above 4,500 feet elevation. And if so, the residential and some commercial generators may deposit food waste and food-soiled paper in a disposal container. Under the emergency circumstances section, the CalRecycle has added that jurisdictions may waive organic waste collection following an example, following a disaster. So for example, the town of Paradise after the Camp Fire this year. Additionally, jurisdictions are not required to separate or recover organic waste removed from homeless encampments and illegal disposal sites in order to protect public health and safety. Lastly, some organic waste diversion may be waived if the CDFA or the Agricultural Commissioner requires organic waste to be disposed due to quarantine. And then we also made some amendments to Article 4, the education and outreach, in response to comments to clarify and provide more flexibility. So first, jurisdictions must provide print or electronic media to generators about the organic waste collection service and the other outlined requirements in this section. Direct contact via workshops may be in supplement to this requirement. And then the requirements to outreach to linguistically isolated generators was also revived. We received many questions about this. So to clarify as well as to provide jurisdictions more flexibility. So for any language with 10,000 or 0.5% of a jurisdiction's residents that speak that language and English less than very well, a jurisdiction must make outreach information available in that language online. And for any language spoken by more than 50,000 or 5% of a jurisdiction's residents that speak that language and English less than very well, information must be provided in that language and written materials that a jurisdiction uses to fulfill the education and outreach requirements. Now back to Hank.
Thanks, Kieran. Okay, only 75 more slides left, so we're almost there. Not quite that many, but it's a haul. For Article 6, we've made some amendments. This is the article dealing with biosolids generated at publicly owned treatment works. We have deleted the second section of that article, which would have required all biosolids to be recovered at an organic waste recovery facility starting in January 1, 2022. You'll see when we discuss some of the procurement requirements, there are amendments in that section to encourage recovery and recycling of biosolids and incentivize that activity, but we did not feel we could continue to propose a ban on all disposal of biosolids in this, as proposed in this article. Relative to the changes in Article 7, we have added provisions specifying that self-haulers can take commingled organic waste to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. The previous draft limited self-hauling to a requirement that all material be source separated and taken to a source separated organic waste recovery facility if it's going to be self-hauled. We've mirrored this requirement to be similar to the collection requirements where a high diversion organic waste processing facility could be an option. And we have deleted requirements for self-haulers to report to jurisdictions annually. You'll see in Article 13 there's corresponding changes for the jurisdiction reporting requirements relative to self-haulers as well. In Article 8, which in the previous draft was specific to CalGreen building standards requirements, we have added a an additional cross-reference to the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, requiring cities and jurisdictions to require and enforce the Model Water Efficiency Landscape Ordinance provisions that are applicable to organic waste recovery. Specifically, that's sections 492.6, subdivisions A1, paragraph C, D, and G. And those provisions are specific to application of compost, mulch, and other materials on new landscaping projects and redesigned landscaping projects. Okay, and moving to Article 10, and just noting that some of the articles are not covered in this, just for this presentation, really focusing on the articles and the changes. If an area was not changed substantively, we're not presenting on that today, but please do consult the regulations on that. So for Article 10, for commercial edible food generators, that's section 3 of that article, we've specified that commercial edible food generators are required to recover the maximum amount of edible food that would otherwise be disposed. This replaces previous language relative to recovering an amount appropriate to that business. We felt that this revised language more closely aligns with the statutory requirements. We've also added provisions clarifying that commercial edible food generators are required to recover edible food unless specified extraordinary circumstances exist. The extraordinary circumstances that we've added into the language mirror or are similar to the extraordinary circumstances or extenuating circumstances identified in the corrective action plan for jurisdictions. Specifically, this would be a natural disaster would be an extraordinary circumstance, or a specific extraordinary circumstance would be that the jurisdiction has not met its edible food recovery programmatic requirements, and that is preventing the commercial edible food generator from meeting its requirements. For section 5 of this article, relative to food recovery services and organizations, we have eliminated the threshold for record keeping for those services and organizations, provided that they are accepting food from commercial edible food generators subject to the requirements of this section. We previously had a threshold of any entity recovering 6 tons or more on an annual basis. This has been revised so that it's any entity receiving material from a commercial edible food generator is required to keep the record specified in that section. Okay, so for Article 11, for organic waste capacity planning, we've clarified the requirements for when a jurisdiction can use a locally based waste characterization study. Essentially, if the study is more recent than the department's latest waste characterization study, if the study includes at least the same category of organic waste materials, was performed by another city located within the jurisdiction, and is statistically significant, then a jurisdiction may substitute the department's waste characterization study and use that study instead. We've also refined the reporting timelines for jurisdictions and other entities, specifying that jurisdictions are required to report within 180 days or 120 days to a county if they receive a request from a county for information, so that the county can comply with its requirements under this section, and specify that a county shall identify in their report to CalRecycle if they did not receive information within 120 days. And we've specified that for other entities that may be contacted by a jurisdiction, such as a county or a city, for information required by this section, that they are required to respond within 60 days of receiving that request. For edible food recovery, we've added language requiring jurisdictions to consult with food recovery organizations and services in their planning for edible food recovery capacity. And then for the schedule for reporting for capacity planning, we have delayed the date for the first submission to August 1 of 2022. The previous draft required the organic waste capacity planning information to be submitted in February of 2022. So this is now pushed back by several months. So a lot of changes in Article 12, which deals with the procurement of recovered organic waste products. We have clarified for compost that compost must be produced at an appropriately permitted solid waste facility, and we've also provided a cubic yard conversion factor So it's not just in tons, but it's also in cubic yards of 1.45 cubic yards. We've expanded the range of renewable natural gas uses that can count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. So renewable natural gas that is developed through the recycling of organic waste can count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target if it is used for transportation fuel. That is the same as the previous requirements, but now in addition to that, it may count if it's used for electricity, heating, or pipeline injection. And we've also added that electricity derived from biomass conversion facilities to the range of products that can count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. Relative to those changes, we have also added some specification for POTWs and biomass conversion facilities in order for the gas or electricity produced at those facilities to be eligible to count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. Those facilities need to demonstrate and certify that they are receiving feedstock from solid waste facilities. This is necessary to help ensure that these facilities and the products they're producing are actually helping pull organic waste out of the waste stream and into recovery and reduce the amount of organic waste disposed. Additionally, as I mentioned, we've eliminated the requirement for POTWs to recover all biosolids that are generated, but we've specified that gas produced from a POTW is only eligible to count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target if the POTW recovers 75% of the biosolids it produces. And additionally, we revised the organic waste product conversion factors. We consulted with ARB to develop conversion factors for the new products that are eligible. And we've also revised the diesel gallon equivalent for transportation fuel. It was previously 19 diesel gallon equivalent, it is now 21. And the population factor has been revised from 0.07 to 0.08. This is, as I mentioned, as we're developing the environmental impact report, we have been updating our disposal projections with 2015, 2016, and 2017 actuals for disposal, and that has shown an increase in the amount of organic material and the total amount of solid waste disposed. So we are in the process of updating those numbers, and we'll be providing those as part of the environmental impact report. Additionally, as it relates to recycled content paper procurement requirements, Section 3 of this article, we have deleted the minimum recycled content levels for paper products and aligned the paper procurement requirements with the Public Contracts Code. Essentially, in lieu of requiring a minimum recycled content amount for paper procured by jurisdictions, we're requiring jurisdictions to comply with the Public Contracts Code requirements, which essentially require a preference for recycled content material if the price and quality is equal to virgin material. And then for paper products, we have deleted from that definition insulation and panels from the list of materials, and so that has a direct impact on the paper product procurement requirements, as those would no longer be subject to the procurement requirements. So for Article 13, this is relative to jurisdiction reporting. The initial jurisdiction compliance report has been revised in a number of ways. We have narrowed the categories of information that a jurisdiction needs to report on in the initial compliance report. Originally, it was subject to all of the annual reporting requirements. It is now narrowed to just reporting on information relative to the organic waste collection services provided in Article 3. We have also delayed the date for when that compliance report needs to be submitted to the initial report needs to be submitted in April of 2022. And then for the complete and regular annual report, we have delayed the date for submitting the complete report for 2022 to October of 2022. And this is the report that normally due in August of 2022 under 1383. The August report would cover January through June of 2022. The report is still required to cover those same months, but it can now be submitted in October of 2022. And corresponding to the deletion for requirements of self-haulers to report to jurisdictions, we have deleted requirements for jurisdictions to report on the amount of self-hauled organic waste. And we have added additional reporting requirements relative to the new provisions that we've discussed today. There's a number of changes to enforcement, both relative to CalRecycle's enforcement as well as jurisdiction enforcement. relative to Article 14, and the first section of that is jurisdictions, inspection, and enforcement requirements. We have delayed the date for when route reviews are required to begin. Previously, it was February of 2022. It is now April of 2022. We've clarified that route reviews are designed to ensure that generators are in compliance with only subdivision A of 18984.9, and specifically that is the organic waste generators requirements to have service and reduce contamination. Subdivisions B and C were previously a part of the route review requirements, and those are relative to checking internal containers, ensuring that employees are educated about reducing organic waste disposal and using the proper containers. Those are no longer subject to the route review. Those do not need to be monitored or verified as a part of the route review. This is meant to clarify that the route reviews do not require internal inspections. We've also reduced the frequency for verifying waivers from annual to once every 24 months. And for the implementation record and record-keeping requirements, we've increased the time for preparing an implementation record upon request by the department to 10 days. It was previously within 1 business day. And we only require the record to be current within 60 days, whereas the previous requirement was that it had to be current within the last 30 days. For Section 4 of this article, enforcement by a jurisdiction, we have revised the timelines for issuing a penalty for a second offense. Specifically, we've clarified that a second offense is a violation of the same section that occurs within 1 year of imposing a penalty for a first offense, meaning that if a penalty is imposed, a second level penalty, which is a higher penalty amount, is only required if the violation still occurs within 1 year. If it exceeds a 1 year timeline, it would become a first offense. The Article 16 penalty amounts have also been revised for jurisdictions, and I'm skipping up 14 to 16. I'll come back to Article 15, which is CalRecycle's enforcement. We've eliminated per day penalties for jurisdictions to impose. So all penalties imposed by jurisdictions are on a per violation basis. And then we have eliminated penalties associated with the requirements of generator requirements in 18984.9B. Again, these are the same requirements I referenced earlier, which would have required internal inspections at businesses. For Article 15, department enforcement action over jurisdictions, we have added provisions allowing for an initial corrective action plan. And the corrective action plan is, which can, under the current regulation, be issued for up to 24 months. We have added language allowing an initial corrective action plan issued due to inadequate capacity and extenuating circumstances and substantial effort demonstrated by the jurisdiction to be extended by up to 12 months. We have also added under Section 7 of that article that federal facilities are another category of entities that may be placed on the non-compliance inventory list. So continuing to Article 15 and then as well Article 16. We have limited penalties for a second and subsequent offense of non-compliance with the same requirement to occurring within 5 years. So this is for the department's penalties that are implemented. Previously, there was no time frame. We are proposing a 5-year time frame for an offense to be considered a second or third or subsequent offense. For Article 16, the penalties, we have eliminated penalties associated with the internal inspection requirements that I mentioned for businesses. We've added a penalty table for the new Article 17, performance-based source-separated organic waste collection services. And we have added a separate metric for calculating penalties for procurement requirements, given the nature of procurement requirements being on a per-ton annual basis. Those are required to be dealt with a little bit differently and are now outside of the scope of the penalty charts that apply to all of the other requirements. Okay. That covers the breadth of requirements and changes for jurisdictions and haulers in Article 12, or in Chapter 12, and those articles 1 through 17. Now moving to requirements for solid waste facilities, which are amendments to existing chapters and articles of Title 14 and Title 27. Specifically, the chapters that we're amending in existing chapters that are being amended in Title 14 are on the screen right now, and we'll walk through those now. So Chapter 3, Article 6 deals with transfer processing requirements. Section 17409.5.1 is the organic waste recovery efficiency measurement standard. This has been revised to align with the amended sampling requirements, which I'll go over here in a moment. And those amended sampling requirements are in .52 and .55. So this section is essentially just amended to reflect those changes. The revised sampling requirements are for section 17409.5.2 through .55. Essentially what we have done is we have replaced the 1 cubic yard sample size with a 200-pound sample size, which is more closely aligned with standard measurements at solid waste facilities as well as measurements for waste characterization studies. We have replaced the daily sampling requirements with quarterly sampling periods. So the previous requirement was for cubic yard samples to be taken every day. There's now a 200-pound sample for each material stream subject to sample must be taken 10 times per quarter. So 40 samples for each stream are required annually. The quarterly period for samples is required that those samples are taken over 10 consecutive days. And an operator may take more than 10 samples per quarter as provided in the regulations. So these measurements at transfer processing stations are relative to .52 and .53 are the measurements of organic waste recovered from the mixed waste organic collection stream, that's .52, and then measurements of organic waste and material removed from that stream for disposal, and then similar requirements for source-separated material that's recovered and source-separated material that's disposed. It's the same type of sampling that's done in each of these sections. In 17409.56, we have added language specifying that construction and demolition debris is not subject to the sampling requirements we just discussed, and that material must be kept separate from the source-separated organic waste collection stream and the mixed waste organic collection stream. So essentially the residential and commercial streams that are being hauled to a facility should be kept separate from C&D material. So 17409.57 was previously a requirement for daily load checking on source-separated organic waste material that was received at the facility. We required daily load checks for every 500 tons of material received, or at least 2 load checks per day. That requirement has been deleted and has been replaced with gray container waste evaluations, which are designed to achieve a similar purpose, as well as mentioned with the Article 17 standards for demonstrating the amount of organic waste present in the disposal stream. So in lieu of the daily load check requirements, the new section 17409.57 through .572 require a facility to evaluate incoming gray containers, so incoming disposal containers from each jurisdiction. Again, it's a similar sampling protocol of a 200-pound sample. That 200-pound sample is required to be separated for the operator shall separate the organic waste from the non-organic material to determine the ratio of organic waste present in the gray containers received from those jurisdictions. The evaluation frequency for each jurisdiction is determined by the tons received in the previous calendar year. So a facility is not required to perform any evaluation of jurisdiction material if they receive less than 100 tons from a jurisdiction. If it's 1 to 500 tons from a jurisdiction in the previous calendar year, the facility needs to perform 2 evaluations per quarter for that jurisdiction's gray material. 500 to 1,000 tons, it's 3 evaluations per quarter, and more than 1,000 tons is 5 evaluations per quarter for that jurisdiction. So for 17409.59, we've made some revisions. We've added language allowing operators without scales to use alternative methods that are prescribed in AB 901, as approved by the EA with CalRecycle concurrence. For solid waste handling at co-located facilities, we've added a new section 17409.5.10.5. specifying that co-located facilities are only subject to certain sampling requirements if the entire permitted facility disposes of less than 10% of the organic waste it receives. And for the remnant organic materials separated from gray container processing, this is the existing section 17409.511. We have deleted the load checking requirements for that section. So for Chapter 3, Article 6 and Article 6.3, transfer processing EA verification in 17409.512, we have added language requiring operators to make records available for inspection from the EA and requirements for the enforcement agency to review those records and conduct periodic observations of measurements. This replaces a previous requirement in the LEA section of the regulations where specific amounts of sampling frequency had to be observed. Now it is periodic observations. Article 6.3 is the record-keeping requirements. We've added requirement for the operator to keep records regarding the destination of compostable materials that are sent to land application. This is partially to ensure that material can be monitored to ensure that it is being land applied in a manner that reduces or recovers organic waste, meaning that the material is not applied at a thickness or a depth of more than 12 inches. That's the standard in Article 2, as well as the existing land application standards for whether or not that material constitutes recovery or constitutes disposal. I'm now going to talk about the compost requirements and the in-vessel digestion requirements. These will go a little bit quicker because a lot of the requirements are similar, but somewhat adapted from the transfer processing requirements. Again, we have deleted the daily load checking requirements for incoming source separated organic waste material that compost facilities were previously required to perform. And in the operating standards, we have revised the methods for determining the presence of organic waste material sent to disposal. Again, we have switched from a cubic yard sample performed every day to a 200-pound sample performed at quarterly intervals of 10 consecutive days. For the record-keeping requirements for compost facilities, we've added similar provisions for the operator to keep records regarding the destination of compostable materials sent to land application. This does not include finished compost, just compostable materials that have not been composted. And we've added language requiring the operator to make similar language that mirrors the transfer processing requirements for operators to make records available for inspection from the EA, and for the EA to review records and conduct periodic observations of measurements. Similar requirements for in-vessel digestion facilities. The daily load checking requirements have been deleted, and the measuring requirements for material sent to disposal have been aligned with the compost and the transfer processing sampling standard of quarterly 200-pound samples at 10-day intervals. And the record-keeping requirements for in-vessel digestion facilities have similarly been amended to mirror the compost and transfer processing amendments to record-keeping requirements in terms of keeping records, making them available for the LEA for observation, and keeping additional records relative to material that's sent to land application. Under Article 6 for in-vessel digestion, we have added language requiring that digestate that is transported for further processing must be transported to a facility that meets the incompatible materials limits. This would be a transfer station that demonstrates less than 10% contaminants in the material it sends on to further processing, or a compost facility that demonstrates less than 10% of its organic waste, less than 10% of the material it sends to disposal is organic waste. Chapter 5, Article 2.2, this is the LEA performance standards and evaluation criteria. We have changed our amendments to this section from how they were originally proposed. We have eliminated the requirements for LEAs to observe at least one sample of each measurement per quarter at every solid waste facility. That has been replaced with the record-keeping monitoring requirements for the LEA to observe periodic measurements. And we have added record-keeping and LEA monitoring requirements for compostable materials sent to land app, where the LEA is required to sample and monitor a statistically significant amount of land applied material to ensure that the material was applied in a manner that constitutes recovery of organic waste. The changes to Chapter 9, Article 9.25, these are changes to the recycling and disposal reporting system. There were changes proposed in the previous draft to those regulations. Those have been refined in this latest draft. For Section 18815.5, we've aligned the reporting requirements with the revised sampling protocols. That's the shifting from cubic yard daily samples to the 200-pound quarterly samples. We have added reporting for determining the recovery efficiency of a designated source separator organic waste recovery facility, so similar to the obligation for a facility to report to the department on its recovery efficiency for mixed waste. That's been processed and recovered. Source separated organic waste recovery efficiency is now also required to be reported. And we have added reporting provisions for the gray container waste evaluation sampling. All of these provisions will be reported through the normal frequency of RDRS and those quarterly reporting periods. For Section 1815.6, we have similarly added these the same requirements for disposal facilities or landfills for the gray container waste evaluation sampling. As we talk about Title 27 changes, you'll see the landfills have the same same requirements as transfer processing stations for sampling gray container waste. Okay, we're almost there. Title 27 changes, Chapter 3, Subchapter 4, Article 2. We have deleted the proposed requirement for long-term intermediate cover to be applied at a depth of 36 inches. That section has been deleted in its entirety. Relative to Article 4, essentially the same gray container waste evaluation requirements that apply to transfer processing stations will now also apply to landfills. Landfill requirements for performing daily load checking of source separated organic waste material has been deleted and similarly replaced with the gray container waste evaluations. The metrics and language is identical to the transfer processing evaluation requirements with few changes noted for reference in terms of disposal facility versus transfer processing facility. Okay, so for the status impact report, we have made a number of changes. We have, and this is partially in reflection of the fact that we have eliminated the long-term cover requirements. We've added requirements to identify areas of the landfill. So when the operator is preparing the status impact report, we've added requirements that the operator needs to identify areas of the landfill that will have intermediate cover and the length of time that the area will have intermediate cover. We've added requirements for operators that identify any area that will use intermediate cover for more than 12 months to perform a study that includes the following. The study needs to evaluate the effectiveness of intermediate cover compared to the proposed final cover in meeting the existing gas monitoring and control requirements. And if the study shows that the intermediate cover is less effective than the final cover, the operator shall provide a revised intermediate cover design that would be as effective. Okay, so it is 1:25. I'm going to open it up for folks to ask questions for clarification. As I noted, the public comment period will start tomorrow. So comments that are made today, you'll hear frequently from us throughout that if you have a comment, it needs to be submitted in writing anytime tomorrow through July 3rd. In order for it to be included in the rulemaking record. I also want to where comments can be submitted is on the screen right now. And also want to clarify that for the 15-day comment period, comments should only be made on the proposed changes from the previous text. The text that is unchanged was already subject to a 45-day comment period and is not subject to comments during this round. The changes should be focused on new text, which is denoted in bold green, or text that has been removed or deleted, which is noted in the red strike through of the text that you have available. To the extent that changes were not made in response to a comment, we are preparing comment responses that for the final submission of the rulemaking package that will explain why changes were made or not made. If a change was not made, we have a reason for not making a change. So if folks have comments or questions for clarifying, there are microphones here at the podiums for folks to come up and ask questions. And for folks participating online, if you submit a written question to the email box, that will be read aloud as well. And if there's no comments, that's fine too.
Good afternoon. Brian Probalski from Orange County Waste and Recycling. I'm looking for clarification on 20901, which is the gray container inspections at landfills. So would there be any, is there an opportunity to use other characterization studies that are done by the jurisdiction through the transfer stations to alleviate this? Or is this only for the gray container material that's coming to the landfill? Because our back of the napkin, we've had 10 hours to look at this. Looks like we may have to do 600-700 waste characterization studies at the Orange County landfill system every year, something which we do 0 of now, have no staff, no facilities, no capacity to do that. That seems like a whole lot of infrastructure to stand up to satisfy this. Is that the intent?
So we're certainly open to seeing alternative ways of measuring it, and also the frequency that we've proposed in this is proposed for comment, so we can get comments on that. We wanted to put this in to relieve the daily load checking requirements, but also provide an ability for providing relief for jurisdictions from their contamination monitoring requirements if they can demonstrate that the facilities are showing a very small amount of organic waste is present in their gray containers. We are comfortable providing relief from their contamination monitoring requirements. So that was the intent. We are not married to those thresholds as we propose. So if there's a alternative frequency that would be more manageable, and it would be helpful to understand the numbers for the landfills that you operate and how many samples would be required under the current proposal. And if there's an alternative, we're certainly open to that.
Gotcha, but as it reads, my interpretation is accurate?
I don't know how much material the landfills that Orange County operates
30
receives.
jurisdictions over the 1,000 threshold times 20 times
Okay, right.
gets you 600 or 700 probably.
So your interpretation is accurate, but that's, again, these are numbers that we put out so we could get feedback on this portion.
You also mentioned different times per day, different times of the day. Do you have any further clarification on what your intent is on? I guess I get the concept, but that gray material doesn't come in till later in the day because the route trucks start in the morning, come back later in the day. We've got to cover the landfill, 4 or 5 o'clock. There may not be enough hours in the day to take that material in, other than maybe the very first load, if at all possible. Rather than taking loads later in the day, you'd never be able to sort it out and then get it covered.
So that's a good comment. We'll please submit that in writing. We'll have to take a look at that. The intent was to ensure that there was variety in the samples, but I think that's kind of a part of that was looking at transfer stations. Maybe landfills are a little bit different, so it'd be good to have that comment in writing so we can consider that for changes in the next draft.
Great. Thanks, Hank and team. We'll get back to you.
Thanks.
I was going to say good morning. Good afternoon. Chuck White with Manette, Phelps & Phillips. I've got 2 questions, requesting clarification. I'd like to say that that's done after reading all 165 pages, but I only made it through page 15, so we got 2 questions through page 15. At the bottom of page 12, and you mentioned in your presentation early on, Hank, that if operator demonstrates that approved material recovery fines that will be used for cover materials do not include organic waste, the use of material recovery fines shall not constitute disposal. And I'm just thinking of the situation where you have a facility that processes MRF fines and removes substantially all of the organics and results in a residual that is virtually organic free, but may have some minor amount of organic material. Does this mean that the entire residual would constitute disposal of organics, or does it mean only that small fraction of the residuals that is actually organics would constitute organic disposal? And I prefer one answer over the other, depending on what it is, but I'm assuming you only really meant that small fraction that might be in the residual that is organics, you'll only be counting that portion as organic disposal, not the entire residual material that may contain other materials besides organics. And we'll put this in writing as well, but I just was curious about what you were trying to do there.
Yeah, it will be good to get that in writing, and that it was the intent that you were hoping for, in the sense of
Yes.
It would not mean, certainly we couldn't count the entire tonnage to be organic waste disposal if the entire tonnage is not in fact organic waste.
That makes sense.
However, we can't discount the organic waste that's being disposed and say it's not
Understood.
disposal of organic waste.
Understood completely. That's good. And then the second question I had, on a couple pages later, I did make it through the next page, 15, but that's where I basically collapsed. The bottom of page 14, you give some IE examples of organic waste differentiated by type. I'm assuming that is the type differentiation you'd like to see reported, that you don't need any more or less, you'd like to see those types reported on, and that's the extent of the categorization that would be required.
That's correct. Those are the categories, and IE, not EG. So it's
Okay.
limited to those, and that is the standard. We worked with ARB on that, and there's a standard materials list that includes those categories. So that's the intent.
I just hope you keep on giving the answers I want to hear, Hank. Thank you.
Can I ask a question from sitting down over here? You want me to stand up? It's okay.
Yes, you can go ahead and please do identify name and affiliation for folks online.
My name's Mark Bragg. Our company is called U.S. Biogas. We're in the process of developing some, I would call them independent ADs to accept SSO, green waste, and soiled paper in various jurisdictions. But the question I have, we're kind of at the absolute bottom of the food chain, so to speak. I made it through page 2 last night, so I was very tired. My question really is about an early statement you made about removing compostable plastic bags from the waste stream before they're processed. And is that what you meant?
So there are 2 changes in the regulation relative to compostable plastic bags, or compostable plastics and plastic bags. So the requirement is a jurisdiction has an obligation to provide a variety of service types. If they're providing a 3-container collection service, one of their requirements is that the green container is limited to organic waste. We have, in response to comments, added provisions stating that compostable plastics can be included in the green container without that container without violating the requirement to only limit that container to organic collection of organic waste. However, in order for that to be allowed, the facility has to provide certification in writing to the jurisdiction stating that they in fact recover that material as part of their process for recovering organic waste. If the facility that's receiving that is not recovering material, then it's essentially allowing a contaminant to be introduced into the green material container. So, and then with plastics, just regular plastic bags, we've specified that that can be allowed for collection of organic waste that's placed in containers for recovery, provided that the facility that recovers source-separated organic waste has provided certification in writing that they can remove that as part of their process for recovering organics.
But that's for conventional plastic. If we're talking about compostable plastic bags used for gathering food waste, is it required that those plastic bags be removed before we process the food waste?
If it was a material that was being removed before it was processed, then it's essentially comparable to a plastic bag. If it's recovered as, the requirement for compostable plastics is that it would be recovered as part of the process.
If our process doesn't require the removal in the process, my question really is, will...
So if you're putting the plastic bags through the digester,
Yes,
digesting them,
right.
then your obligation would be to provide certification to the jurisdiction indicating that you recover that material.
I see, okay, thank you.
And I do want to mention for folks with comments or questions, to the extent that you have comments that you'll be submitting in writing, if you provide recommendations for how to address issues, particularly as we're talking about the issue with the Orange County landfills, recommendations for how to change the language, specific recommendations for written language is very helpful and makes it so it's easier for us to make sure that we are appropriately addressing your comment or your concern. So I would encourage folks to try and include, to the extent they can, recommendations for language as they submit their comments. Greg?
Hi, Greg Kester, California Association of Sanitation Agencies. Thanks a lot, Hank, and everyone for your work on this. A question, if we can't repeat comments that we made in the first round, when will the response to those comments be issued? Will it be after adoption of the final rule?
It will be, the comment responses will be included in the final rulemaking package submitted to OAL.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank you for coming all the way down here to Southern California. Preclude. My name is Lane Baraldo of Synagro, and it's amazing how you can fit 600 people in this room, but that's pretty impressive. But following up on Greg's comment, it seems like the language that you have that is not affected by either red line or strikeout would be considered now final rule language that you're going to propose?
It's not that it's necessarily final. It's that we are not required to respond to comments on text that was not changed. So to the extent we may change other portions that would require a corresponding change to those sections. So those are not necessarily final, but with respect to responding to comments, we won't be responding to comments that are on text that was already subject to a comment period.
Okay, because there's two sections in there when I didn't get through 15 pages, but I focused on just 2 of the pages. And one was Article 2, where you talk about organic waste that is sent to one of the following facilities, operations, or used for the following activities and not subsequently sent to landfills for disposal shall be deemed to constitute a reduction in landfill disposal. And you have section, under that you have 6, which says land application as defined in section 17852A, 24.5 of this division, subject to the following conditions. And you talk about biosolids, which is my emphasis. It says, 1, have undergone anaerobic digestion or composting, as defined in Part 503, 40 CFR Part 503. And 2, meet the requirements of Section 17852A 24.5B6, which is, in effect, either the general order from the State Water Resources Control Board or site-specific WDRs for land application. And then in conjunction with Article 9, where you talk about quote, "A jurisdiction shall not implement or enforce an ordinance, policy, procedure, permit condition, or initiative that includes provisions that do any of the following," and you say, under that one, "prohibit the lawful processing and recovery of organic waste through a method defined in Article 2 of this chapter," which includes, the general order and all that. So my question to you would be, does this preclude a jurisdiction, being a county or a city, from enforcing an ordinance on biosolids land application that would be any more stringent than the general order or site-specific WDR?
It's a really good question. I'm going to look at Mr. Block for helping with a response to that one.
So our intent was not to prohibit more stringent requirements as long as they're based on health and safety requirements. So we have actually had that come up recently internally, so we're looking at that language just to make sure it's clear.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Colleen Foster, City of Oceanside. First of all, thank you. I have seen a lot of response to the comments provided in this new rendition of the rule. I just want to respond to the last comment by Mr. Block and the question. I recently met with CalRecycle, and I was told that SB1383, the language in it was to eliminate barriers towards biosolids land application in California. So I just heard from you that the intent is to not prohibit any more stringent laws or restrictions on biosolids application in California.
So the key part of what I said was related to health and safety issues. Obviously, we are looking at increasing the recycling of this and eliminating artificial barriers, and that's why I said we needed to look at this language more carefully. But to the extent that there's actually a legitimate health and safety issue for certain restrictions, that's not something we're trying to change with these regulations. So it's an issue that needs a little bit more work.
Because there's a
Just to make sure
significant
it's clear.
difference in biosolids application in Northern California versus Southern California, along with the interpretation of health and safety issues.
Understood.
Thank you.
Through Public Services, I'm operating at a little bit of a disadvantage since I wasn't able to print the document. I broke a couple of printers at my hotel this morning and apologize to them profusely. And to pick the scab again of what you can and can't change going forward, you could still see the error in your ways on documents that have not been changed and make a change on your own if you so choose, correct?
Correct.
Okay. MRF fines. Chuck White got the answer that he wanted, so I wanted to pursue this a little bit further. Could you explain to me again exactly the direction we've gone on this? Because I don't think I like the answer necessarily. Because I think we went from having MRF fines being somewhat de minimis to now having MRF fines containing no organics at all.
Sure. So for the original draft that was introduced in January, we included language essentially stating that if MRF fines were used as cover material, it wouldn't constitute the disposal of organic waste. And that was based on an understanding that MRF fines were primarily not containing organic waste. Subsequent to introducing that language, we've heard from a number of operators that MRF fines may, in some cases, be predominantly or primarily organic waste. So we do not feel it was appropriate to continue to have language stating that use of this type of a type of organic waste as cover wouldn't constitute disposal of organic waste. But we've included language in here, so if the operator can demonstrate that their MRF fines are free of organic waste, then it wouldn't constitute disposal of organic waste because it's in fact not organic material. So that's why we've shifted from where we were saying our understanding is MRF fines are not made of organic waste. We've heard information contrary to that through the formal rulemaking process, and so we've changed the regulation to reflect that. If MRF fines are going to be used, there needs to be a demonstration that it's not in fact organic waste before we can positively say that it's not disposal.
I'm trying to figure out how that fits with the question of whether the portion of those MRF fines that would be organic would only be considered as disposal of organics, not the whole waste stream, and how that fits with the potential to use it as ADC.
So it'll be good if you can submit a comment on this piece, but we'll have to parse out in terms of how it would be assigned, I guess is your question, is if you use 20 tons of MRF fines as cover material and only 10% of it is organic waste, that's not 20 tons of organic waste disposal, that's 2 tons. And so how that's appropriately assigned, something we'll have to take a look at. I don't know that the current language details that piece, so it'll be good to get a comment on that so we can refine that.
And I've asked this before, I think, but are plastics considered organic?
No.
Could you say that
No.
louder? Oh, thank you. On containers, and we've talked about this at length too, the way that I read the regulations right now is that if a container goes out of service during the, say in 2025, that container, single container, would have to come back in service under the new color scheme proposed by 1383. And I know that you've moved the date back for full compliance, and I appreciate that very much. I think that's a very good change, but we still have that problem, I think, of having multiple combinations of colors being thrown out there on containers from one house to the next, potentially. We could have a virtual Disneyland of colors in our service areas. And I'm just curious as to whether that was the intent, or is the intent to be a little bit more methodical, that perhaps when you've got a particular business unit or a new contract coming up is when you would change that out.
So the intent is to allow it to change over time by 2036 in the way that the jurisdiction or the operator sees fit. Our primary focus is that by 2036, we don't have a Disneyland type situation any longer, but that all the containers are of a standardized color across the state. So to the extent that I think we added language to try and clarify that, but if you feel that continues to need clarification, it would be good to get written comments on that. But our intent with that section, and also as communicated in the initial statement of reasons for this, is that the operator could replace those over time, so long as by 2036 the containers are of the right color.
Okay, that's enough. Thank you.
Excuse me, Greg Kester again with CASA. I don't mean to belabor the point, but what Mr. Block said is really in contrast to 2 years of working with you all on this. And I would just make the point that the federal regulations of Part 503, the State Water Board's Environmental Impact Report, and statewide general order were all intended to protect the public health and safety. So I hope that it's a significantly high bar that any local jurisdiction would have to cross in order to be more restrictive. And I would assume, since we're talking about it now, that this is something I could provide comments on.
Yes, you're certainly welcome to provide comments on that piece. As Elliot mentioned, we'll be taking a closer look. I think, again, the crux of the issue is the interpretation of health and safety in that. And so, yeah, please do provide further comments on that.
Yeah, because the whole public wastewater sector collaborative partnership falls apart if we're not able to land apply our biosolids across the state. It's a huge, huge issue for us.
Yaniv Sherson with Energia. Wanted to thank CalRecycle for coming down to Southern California and walking us through the regs. And in your defense of the changes, in aggregate, it's like 10 pages. So I think doable for 24 hours of reading. I had a clarifying question on Article 17, the new section on performance-based source-separate organic waste collection service. So I just wanted to run through the logic to make sure my interpretation was correct. So that's saying if a jurisdiction does a 3-cart collection system on 90% of the service area, the requirement of the gray container on number 3 basically says, so long as the gray container doesn't have more than 25% organic waste, we're good. It's compliant. So that makes sense, that's clear. So if a jurisdiction doesn't elect for this section, but elects for the Article 3, the standard 3-cart collection, my question is, 3-cart collection system, organics are collected in the green bin. Is the gray container also subject to the 25% audit pursuant to section, I think, 17409 methodology?
The gray containers would still be subject to audit, but the actions that result from the results of those audits would be different. So for Article 17, to continue to qualify for the compliance exemptions that are received under that article, jurisdiction needs to demonstrate that the source-separated organic waste containers are going to a facility that recovers 75% of source-separated organic waste. And then, as you mentioned, no more than 25% of the content of their gray container is organics. If they don't meet those standards, they would no longer qualify for implementing that type of service, and they would revert to being subject to the entirety of Chapter 12. They would no longer have the exemptions from enforcement, education outreach, contamination monitoring, et cetera. For a jurisdiction implementing a system under Article 3, so not pursuing Article 17's performance-based system, the landfill or the transfer station is required to sample gray container regardless of the type of system the jurisdiction is implementing. So that information would be collected and reported to the department. If the jurisdiction is implementing a 3-container system, they're obligated to implement all the contamination monitoring requirements unless the reports from transfer stations and landfills demonstrate that the gray container waste from that jurisdiction is less than 25% organic. So the requirement for a jurisdiction, if more than 25% of their gray container waste is organic and they're implementing a Article 3 service, is that they have to continue to do contamination monitoring, have to continue, they have to continue to do contamination monitoring to try and reduce that.
Okay, thanks. And just to follow up for clarity, though, under the Article 3 scenario, with the 3-cart collection system, organics in the green bin, green bin has to go to a SSO facility subject to the 75. The gray bin, though, is it, as I interpret, the gray bin monitoring of the 25% yes or no is not pursuant to the 17409 methodology. It's subject to transfer stations audit check, or am I misinterpreting? Does the transfer station, I guess my question is, does the transfer station have to also use the 17409 methodology, the quarterly 10 samples, 200 pounds?
For the gray container?
For the gray container.
Evaluations, that is, regardless of the type of service the jurisdiction is implementing, there would be gray container sampling for a Article 3 3-container system, an Article 3 2-container system, or an Article 17 3-container system. The gray containers would be sampled.
Okay. Great. My confusion is because as I read it, I didn't see 17409 at all in the 3-container section unless I missed it, but the 2-bin and the 1-bin do have it, reference to that in Article 3. So just a clarification.
Yeah, in Article 3, it's in the contamination monitoring requirements where there's a reference to that.
Okay.
But I think we may have missed a reference to the landfill piece. So if you can please make sure you have a comment on that. But
okay,
we'll take a closer look.
Great, thank you.
Monica White, Edgar & Associates. Thank you guys so much for all the work you guys have put into this. This is pretty exciting for it to come to fruition, especially with inclusions of the performance-based measurements and making sure that we're closing the gaps on the gray can and taking a close look at how much organics is destined to landfill so that we can continually monitor the performance of jurisdictions. Sticking with that theme, This is in regards to the edible food recovery tiers, and I've had a couple conversations with staff about this. I wonder if there's an opportunity to also measure performance with edible food recovery, as it seems that the new definition of edible food has broadened the category of materials that would be included, which is fantastic in that it makes this 20% edible food recovery standard a little bit more aggressive, I think, than it previously was. So with that, when we look at the tiers that are currently set up with the generators, we have a pretty low threshold of generators that are included under those tiers. And as we start implementing more and more edible food recovery programs, what we expect to see, based on real experience, is that the amount of pounds collected from these generators are also going to decrease as they become more savvy into how to reduce waste internally. Where the concern is there's obviously a need for initial infrastructure funds that'll help deal with this waste, and then we would have a curve of drop in tons without the expansion of additional companies brought into the tiers, if you follow me. What I wonder is if through your monitoring and performance, as we start looking at the recovery of edible food, if there's a way to include a clause in the text that says, say California is starting to not meet that 20% threshold of recovering edible food, that we could then expand the tiers of generators. And that way we could cast kind of a broader net of companies that would be subject to recovering edible food. Specifically, as I said, based on our experiences, we're seeing companies get more savvy at how to source reduce, and we need more food to feed people. And I think that having that type of text in there might activate early adopters as well that wouldn't be subject to the mandatory recovery requirements.
Thanks. Thanks for the comment or the question, and it would be good to get that in writing, specifically in terms of what a trigger, recommendations for what a trigger would look like. This is definitely, that piece of the regulations is the newest piece for us in terms of types of activities that we regulate. So certainly open to different concepts on that, but if there's not just a trigger, but the types of entities that you would recommend, that would be something we could consider.
I mean, typically with a lot of the successful programs we're seeing, it's any permitted operation that has, is subject to health and safety codes with their kitchens or any other operations could have edible food that could be recovered. So it's, in a perfect world, if I were Queen of California, I would say that anyone who had a permitted operation could be a part of edible food recovery. Certainly, it might be hard to mandate the requirements, keeping with the desire to have companies recover food safely, but I don't see any reason why at least our outreach and education couldn't go to all permitted operators, and then having, like I said, the expansion of tiers or expansion of generators if it looks like we weren't meeting the goals that we wanted to. So, thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, Nick, we're out of time.
All right. Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. I actually mostly wanted to agree with both of the points that Monica just made. On the first point, just wanted to thank you for all the effort you have put into hearing stakeholders and looking through the list of changes. I'm not sure I agree with every single one of them, but I can tell which stakeholder raised this and the argument that they had, and I think you guys put a lot of thought into hearing what people were saying. So things like the performance-based standard, as opposed to the more prescriptive standard, the procurement of gas, even the infamous John Davis needles example. So I wanted to commend you on that. I don't think I've ever seen a regulatory agency be that thoughtful in listening to people. And then specifically to Monica's second point, we've talked for forever since the passage of 1383 about not really knowing everything we need to do in the food waste prevention realm, and sort of taking our first cut at the lowest hanging fruit in this regulation, and then coming back with a further regulation down the line when you see the effectiveness in 2020. I still think that it would be very important to commit to that in writing in some form. I would settle for a slide in a PowerPoint, but there should be a process that you guys commit to now to come back for phase 2 of the regulation for edible food. Because we have no idea if what you're proposing is going to get us 20% or 50% or 2%? Thank you.
Well, Elliot's going to be gone in 2022, so I don't know if he cares too much about a written commitment, but no, appreciate the comment, Nick, and certainly something we'll look at. I just want to say, after Chuck, we're going to look to Chris to the extent there's any online comments that he can read. Looks like there's quite a few, so give him an opportunity to look at those, and to the extent they're long, try and paraphrase. But Chuck, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll jump over to those.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll be very brief. I also, Hank, you amaze me at times, your command of these regulations. They're extraordinarily complex. I do want to thank you for the time that you've shown, endless hours that you spent with knuckleheads like me trying to explain, what you're doing here. It's important. There's a lot of good in these regulations, a lot of changes that I think are very productive. That being said, on the intermediate cover, obviously thank you for removing the 36-inch requirement. But if I might ask Mr. DeBee, the report that you envision now and how we evaluate intermediate cover, can you explore that a little bit for me and what you would envision a proof of the fact that our intermediate cover is performing our gas control systems effectively?
So I guess you noted that the regs were much lighter because we removed 3 feet of dirt, so that's my attempt at humor. I'm sorry. We are exploring with this version of the regs another way to compensate for the potential impact on less waste going to landfills and the impact on the controls at landfills. And by evaluating the steady state of landfills relative to a lot of acreage under 12 inches of dirt versus what it might look like capped and closed, we're getting data and information about those impacts and what would be appropriate ways to address those for future actions, if you will. So the intent is to get data on what it looks like with lots of intermediate cover versus what it might look like if some of those areas were closed. So certainly ask lots of questions, and we can address those in more detail in responses or changes.
All right, thank you.
So now we're going to turn over to Chris Bria to get maybe, let's do 3 comments online and then see if there's anyone else in the audience, and then go back and do some more online comments.
Yeah, I've got about 12 questions. And okay, this is from Jennifer Gilbert in City of Davis regarding the requirements for commercial edible food generators to donate their edible food. What if the owner and/or employees or customers wish to take leftover edible food home to eat? The way the regulation is written, this kind of reuse of edible food does not seem to be accounted for and would not be in compliance.
Again, please submit that comment in writing. That's not the intent or how we intended for the statute to be, the regulation to be interpreted. So please do submit that comment in writing.
Okay. There's a few others here, but they directly reference the section and the number. So without the context, you guys have those memorized?
We'll find out.
Okay. Section 18984.1, little a, big A. Does this mean jurisdictions would need to get a new written notice every year?
Yes, so this is for the compostable plastics and plastic bags. The facility, we do require a written certification from the facility, and the intent is for that certification to be resubmitted every year.
Okay. Next up, section 18984.5, little b4. How frequently does this consent need to be given? For each circumstance, once a year, or is one letter of agreement of terms good enough to cover all instances?
So this is referring to the requirement that a designee needs approval from the jurisdiction before they dispose of contents of contaminated containers. Please submit that comment in writing. I don't think, we did not intend for that to be on a necessarily every single load, but that there would need to be some sort of approval process in place, whether that's a prior or post-approval. We'll have to take a look. So if they can submit that comment in writing, we can provide more clarity in the final comment responses, and if necessary, through a revision to the text.
Section 18986.1 little b, why exempt restrooms when so much organic waste, paper towels, comes from restrooms? Sometimes this is 40% of their generated waste.
So that exemption was added for the businesses' collection requirements in response to comments from jurisdictions. If they can submit that comment in writing, that would be helpful. We'll take a look at it.
And the last one of this set, section 20901B, talks about quarterly waste evaluations, but none of the options given in subsection 20901.1 only gives options for 1 to 5 times per year. There's no quarterly option given. Which is it?
Again, so if they can submit that comment in writing, the intent was for it to be if the previous year's disposal measured from a calendar year from an individual jurisdiction exceeds 1,000 tons, so January 1 of 22 to January 1 of 23, then beginning in July, the facility would need to perform an evaluation 5 times per quarter, so a total of 20 times per year. But if there's a need for clarification, or if we miswrote that, it'd be good to get a comment on that.
Just a few more here. This is Serene St. John from It's a Natural Product Incorporated. 1, are commercial food scrap containers also required to be brown? Does this include commercial wheeled carts and bins?
So the collection service color requirements for carts apply to residential and commercial. So yes, if I'm understanding the comment or question correctly, again, if comment can please be submitted in writing during the 15-day comment period, that'll give us more time to evaluate.
Okay. One more from her. Does CalRecycle plan to issue standards for a high-performance MRF for single-stream, single-material recyclables? And if so, what is the time frame? I realize this does not go in the SLCP sections of the PRC, but in an important missing piece of the entire picture.
So again, if that comment can be, or question can be submitted in writing for a single stream unsegregated collection container, the material is required to go to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. That facility needs to recover 75% of the organic content it receives. That organic content would include the traditional blue container, for lack of a better term, recyclables such as paper and cardboard. And then in a 2-container system, if it's a green organic waste limited container to typical yard waste and food waste, and the gray container has paper and cardboard, that would also be counted as part of the 75% that needs to be recovered. But in a 3-container system, it would be good to get the comment, but in a 3-container system, the blue container is not subject to a 75% recovery standard. It would be measured to see, but it doesn't have the same high diversion organic waste processing standard.
Cool. All right, 3 more. This is Nora Cibrian, City of San Jose. Could you please clarify section 18993.1, recovered organic waste product procurement targets? During Hank's presentation, there was a bullet stating that POTWS and biomass conversion facilities must source material from all solid waste facilities in order for their products to count toward jurisdiction's procurement target. Does this mean that if a jurisdiction's POTW reuses biogas it creates during digestion on site, e.g. for heating, but that POTW does not co-digest or receive feedstock from a solid waste facility, the biogas would not count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target.
Again, please submit the comment in writing, but that interpretation is correct, that the procurement targets need to be linked to reducing organic waste that's currently being disposed of in landfills. The way that we demonstrate that in the Article 12 regulations is that the biomass conversion facility or a POTW are sourcing material from the solid waste stream, because these are not like the other materials that produce recovered organic waste. The other facilities that produce recovered organic waste products are permitted solid waste facilities, so that's the additional requirement for these facilities.
Okay, here's a softball before the last two. Will this presentation be posted on CalRecycle's website?
Yes, I do want to clarify, though, that for the presentations that we post, we do have to ensure prior to posting on our website that they're ADA accessible, so we do have to make sure that the PowerPoint meets those requirements before it's posted. So yes, it will be posted at some point.
Right. Okay.
Noted, Chuck.
All right. Selena Copy Hornback, Director of Public Policy, California Assisted Living Association. Section 18984.9, Organic Waste Generator Requirements. Can you clarify whether residential care facilities for the elderly, assisted living communities would follow B and be required to provide containers and recycle in business areas of the building, but not in individual private resident apartments?
That's a good question and comment. We did try to address that in the draft text to clarify that containers don't need to be provided in individual residences, but in the areas of the facility that are accessible to the public. But again, if we can get that comment in writing, we'll be able to provide a response, and if we need to amend the regulation, can consider that.
Can you please clarify Article 17, Jennifer Gilbert from Davis again. Can you please clarify Article 17, Section 18998.2, compliance exemptions? If a jurisdiction implements a performance-based source-separated collection service that meets the requirements of Section 1899.8.1a, does the jurisdiction still need to have the gray, green, blue, color-coded collection bins, or can a jurisdiction use whatever color they want?
That is, the colors still need to be in conformance with the standardized requirements. That is not one of the exceptions under that article.
Okay. It's from Anna Holler, MS Environmental. Wow, I'm impressed, Hank. It's easy to tell you've been working hard. That midterm studying Ken noted must have paid off. All right, two more. Julie Malinsky-Ball, Public Policy Advocates. Article 12, biomass conversion. Biomass needs to be certified. It comes from a solid waste permitted facility. Tree services and suppliers of urban suppliers to biomass plants should have an opportunity to continue to supply that material and claim diversion from landfill. Would CalRecycle consider expanding suppliers beyond solid waste permitted facilities if the suppliers provided specified information?
Yeah, so it would be good to get that comment in writing. And, as I mentioned, our intent in limiting the material that counts coming from a solid waste facility is to ensure that it's being diverted from landfills. So if there's an alternative means of demonstrating that, I think we'd be open to considering that. It hinges on whether or not we can provide that same level of certainty. So yes, please do submit that comment in writing as well as recommendations for how that would be reflected.
Okay. And last one, Jorge Montezuma, Sanitation Districts of Los Angeles County. Procurement question. It seems like only compost, renewable gas for transportation, heating, pipeline electricity, and electricity from biomass conversion can be counted. What about biochar from organic waste?
That's not in the list of products that is currently counted. Happy to review a comment on that piece, since we did amend this portion of the reg to add additional materials. The materials that we did add we added in consultation with the California Air Resources Board as well as the California Energy Commission. There's a couple things that limit what we can include, and one is whether or not we can demonstrate the amount of organic waste feedstock to the amount of organic waste product that's created, as well as that we can demonstrate that the product is actually created from organic waste that was diverted from landfills. So those are the two primary metrics that we are looking at when we identify new types of products. But to the extent they have others that they want to recommend, we'd certainly be open to considering alternative products if we can meet that standard.
Okay, and I just hit send receive and nothing new.
Okay, other comments from folks here in the auditorium. It's 2:20. We do have to be out of the room by 3 o'clock at the latest, maybe a little bit earlier. I'm kind of looking to see if Paul knows for sure, but I thought you were saying we can go longer, so no, please, 3. Okay, we do have to be out of here at 3, so. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gideon Krakow, and also want to note just your fluency with all of this is pretty remarkable, Hank, and thank you all for coming down today. Just, I guess, some logistical questions. Came in a little bit late, perhaps you covered this, but what are the next steps moving forward? If you can sort of give us your best estimate of the timeline moving forward for the regulatory process. And then also the EIR, wondering what the timeline is on that and how that's going to work sort of concurrently with your plans moving forward. Thank you.
Absolutely, great question. So as I mentioned earlier, the plan for the draft EIR is for the draft EIR to be posted at the end of July. We'll have a hearing. We're planning to have a hearing in mid-August timeframe to get comments on the draft EIR. The draft EIR is also subject to a 45-day comment period that would essentially run through the month of August through early September. Concurrent to that, the 15-day comment period for this draft of regulatory text will run until July 3rd. After we have all of that, after that comment period closes, we'll be categorizing and then reviewing comments on the revised text and discussing changes internally. We will provide a revised draft of text. We are aiming for September timeframe to do a third draft to respond to comments and essentially finalize issues that maybe were unaddressed in this second draft, or periods, commas, things like that were out of place. So that's our rough timeline through the fall, and then after the third draft is posted, our primary focus will be finalizing the environmental impact report and responding to comments to that, as well as finalizing the text for submittal to OAL. Our timeline is that we have to have this text submitted by January 18th of 2020, which is when the rulemaking started, which is 1 year from the start of the rulemaking.
Colleen Foster, City of Oceanside. I'm still wrestling out of the hands of my residents purple carts from like 35 years ago that come up every once in a while. So I'm a little concerned about robust organics collection programs that have been recently launched that have yellow bins. For example, one of our largest hauling companies, their food recycling program is yellow carts for commercial businesses. So I'm wondering if the caveat for a yellow bin is the fourth bin. So if you've got a commercial customer that has the gray trash, the blue recycling, has a green waste bin that's green for yard waste, and then has a separate SSO organics bin, can that be yellow or does that have to be brown? I'm really confused by this and concerned because there's existing infrastructure out there.
Sure. Thanks for the comment. As the regs read right now, in response to the comments, we had a number of comments raising concerns about the efficacy of yellow containers for the containers to fade due to UV exposure, and that's why we changed that from a yellow container for food waste to a brown container, and that's also part of why we pushed out the date to 2036. But certainly, please do submit comments on that because we can take a look. We also tried to add clarity for if you want to do SSO in addition to a 4 or 5 or 6 container, that clarity on those colors. But yes, please do submit a comment. And we recognize the challenges with infrastructure, and that was the main reason we tried to push the date back.
And then I do have a second question on the edible food recovery aspect. Originally, the rules drafted had a lot of reporting requirements on food recovery agencies and organizations. And then at some point, you had worked with them, and the reporting requirements were only going to be put upon food recovery agencies that were producing, I believe, 6 tons and more. So you just took that back out. Have you conferred with the food recovery industry? Are they comfortable with that?
Yes, thanks for flagging that. And again, please do submit a comment on that piece, but our team that's working on this, you mentioned there was a lot of back and forth. We have reduced the type of material, not in this draft, but from the original process, the type of information that has to be reported. And from conferring with some of those entities indicated that most food recovery organizations include at a minimum the types of records that were requiring to be kept. And so that was our thinking behind eliminating that threshold.
And then I noticed on that section, you strengthened language on generators, that basically, in no case whatsoever can a generator not recover some amount of food unless 2 circumstances were identified. The jurisdiction fails to provide capacity and/or acts of God. So in that, you kind of put I believe, an additional burden on the jurisdiction to ensure the jurisdiction's building capacity for edible food recovery. I mean, what happens in the scenario where you might have a higher economic area and they don't have as many food recovery agencies within that city? Is that jurisdiction going to be responsible for building capacity in other cities that have food recovery agencies?
That's a really good comment. I think we'll just have to take a closer look at that. Thanks.
Yaniv Sherson with Energia. Clarifying question. So section 17409.5.7, the gray container waste evaluations. If a jurisdiction is subscribed to the 3-cart collection system under Article 3, also subject to the requirement of 17409.5.7 for gray waste evaluations. What happens in the scenario if the evaluation shows that 70% organic or 50% organic are still in that gray bin? Is there an action, or is it just data collection?
At this point, it would just be data collection. There's not a specified action that takes place. We don't know the amount of organic waste that will be present in those containers. So as a first step, our intent is to have this data so we can determine if there's revisions that are needed down the line. But if there's a recommended action, definitely open to considering that if you have include that in your comments.
Okay, well, and then I thought logically the Article 17 logic said there is a auditing of the gray bin for the 25% threshold. If it exceeds 25, there is an action. You don't get the exemption anymore. So I can make a comment, but I'm wondering if the logic train should follow similar, or if there's a different intent.
Do you have an action that you're recommending?
I'm asking if it would make sense that if there's the 25% threshold be in both cases, I think would make sense.
Okay.
I
yeah,
can
we're
propose.
certainly open to consider if there's a specific action you'd recommend being triggered. We don't currently have one in there. Don't see that as a contradiction if that's the comment, but certainly open to considering an action that we could include if there's a recommendation for that.
Okay, yeah, the scenario of concern is just if there's a green waste collection bin program, it's ineffective because food is still in the black bin, data is being collected on the gray bin, there's still a lot of food there, and the data is collected and nothing happens. So that's the concern.
Understood. I think with a 3-container system, the jurisdiction is subject to contamination monitoring requirements that a jurisdiction not implementing a 3-container system is potentially exempt from. And there are significant expenses associated with that. So it's not necessarily that a action would need to be triggered. Of course, we're open to considering that, but it's that they're not eligible for an existing requirement being waived from them.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Sharon Mitchell, County of San Bernardino. I was wondering if you can provide some clarification regarding community service districts with solid waste authority. Would they, I know they're in the jurisdiction definition as being the jurisdiction, so are they going to be reporting directly to the state as their own entity with their own ordinances, reporting, monitoring, enforcement? Or is it similar to the way they're reporting as under the county under 939?
I don't know. We'll have to take a closer look at that. I think our intent was to, in the jurisdiction definition, define the entities that are responsible for solid waste collection. And that is a revision that we made where we previously said solid waste handling, but entities that are responsible for solid waste collection are essentially treated as jurisdictions and responsible for reporting to the department. And then wherever jurisdiction is used throughout the regulation, that would be applied to them. I believe that we've covered that, but if you can submit that question in writing so we can take a closer look.
Okay, so I did do it in the 45-day comment period, so would that be answered along with the final regulations, or do I do another comment?
If you can submit a comment again, particularly we did amend the definition of jurisdiction, so it's certainly something that is subject to a comment response. So.
Okay, and then I also had another question. So in section 18988.3B, you removed the requirement for self-haulers to report to the jurisdiction. However, in Article 15 in Table 7, there's a section that says there's going to be a penalty for a generator who is a self-hauler who fails to comply with the requirements. How would the jurisdiction know that they're failing to comply with that if we're not getting reporting anymore?
It's a good question. We'll have to take a closer look. The intent of deleting those reporting requirements was to relieve a jurisdiction from a burden of having to identify all of those entities to collect information. So it would be more if the jurisdiction became aware either as a result of a complaint or an alternative monitoring system that the jurisdiction implemented. So it would potentially be at the discretion of the jurisdiction how they would find that information out. But we've eliminated the reporting requirement to reduce a burden on jurisdictions.
Okay, so, thank you.
Thank you. I do just want to note the time. It's 2:30. We do have time for additional questions. If there's questions from online, I'm looking to Chris to read those. All right. Other questions from the audience?
All right, I got past page 15. So you have, I'm going to go by pages in the PDF because I was able to print it out. Page 31, you talk about organic material in a CDFA quarantine area, and you say that it can be disposed of unless one of the processing options could take care of it. But we're looking at this, I think you're looking at this as a statewide issue, 1383. So your intent there, I hope, is that as long as processing capacity is available within the quarantine area, not in general, right? Because you may be able to, say, compost or digest out the problem, but if you can't move it out of the quarantine area, you can't do it. So is that probably your intent?
I believe so, but we'll have to take a closer look. If you can submit that comment, this was one of the more complicated provisions to craft, so please do comment on that so we can take a closer look and see if we've captured it correctly. Our intent was to limit it to situations where there truly is no option to recover organic waste, and so that was our intent, but we'll have to take a closer look at moving in or moving out of the quarantine area, because we'll look into Mark if he has any other thoughts on that.
No, just to emphasize a little bit more what you're saying is, it was a hard one to navigate, trying to fully understand the quarantine structure, if you will, or approach from CDFA and the ag commissioners and what would work. So certainly additional insights and comments would be very welcome on that, especially not to guide the comments, but what would be helpful is other approaches to treat material that might not include solid waste infrastructure. It looked like there were some allowances for treatment protocols by the ag commissioners. So that would be of interest to see if those approaches have been taken and how effective they might be.
Thank you. And then this may have been addressed earlier in the process, and maybe I've missed it, but you don't have it in your definitions. I'm wondering if you would consider defining procure. Does procure equal use? And does procure, how does procure relate to creation? Do I have to buy my own compost? If I've created it, have I procured it? And if I've procured it, but I don't have a use for it, but I've procured it and someone else uses it, is it procured?
Sure, the comment would be helpful. I think it's not necessarily in the definitions, but really more in the interpretation of Article 12. We've included language that a jurisdiction is not required to procure it and use it themselves. If they procure the material and give it away at a free compost giveaway, that would potentially count. We mostly want to ensure that the material is being pulled through, but it doesn't necessarily have to be used by individual jurisdiction staff members, if that's the comment. But certainly we can provide clarity on that if it's not in there. So if you can definitely submit that comment in writing. And then just on the quarantine issue, I just want to mention again, I mean, please do submit a comment on that. The balance we're trying to strike is between, if you just say anything that has a quarantine label on it can be disposed, that's a lot of material. So we want to but the flip side is we don't want to encourage material to violate CDFA requirements or ag commissioner requirements, or encourage it to be hauled in a way that would violate that. So that's the balance we're trying to strike. So again, comments on that would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
John Davis, Mojave Desert Mountain Recycling Authority. I actually had a procurement thought as well, and it relates to my question. When we did the characterization work for AB 939, found a real paucity of landscape material across our region, the high desert area, and that really continues to this day. And I'm always thinking of the city of 29 Palms, where there's virtually no turf. I mean, the schools have no turfed areas, okay? And yet they're going to be required now to buy compost, and at whatever rate you calculate. And so, what do we do with that? So I'm having that same question, and I'll submit some thoughts about that. I mean, they could contract for and then wheel that material somewhere where it's actually used, or they could just pile it up. I don't think that's really the intent. So where I was going with the capacity planning, you allow some updated waste characterization, and apparently it has to be post the CalRecycle characterization, and you have one coming, is it next year, or? So we'd have to wait until after that is completed in order to do a updated characterization to enter into the capacity planning requirement, or is it after, as of the date of the regulations? So I'll submit that. I'm not, but as I look, I know that's a new section. We'd very much like to do updated for capacity planning, but if it shows that we still don't have the landscape material, which I'm pretty confident in a lot of our jurisdictions, or we don't, can we somehow relate that? You've got language on the procurement for fuels, for example, that relate to the actual demand for the use of the material, but there's no kind of corollary for compost material. And if you can't contract for fuel, which may be difficult, particularly early on, it's going to be difficult for some of my jurisdictions to actually use the material. So, I've kind of combined statements and questions, but I guess on the capacity planning, was it the intent to let us wait until after the statewide characterization before we could actually do updated characterization work that could be used for the capacity planning?
Sure. I think it's important to separate the procurement from the capacity planning. I don't think they're a parallel situation. Different types of requirements. For the waste characterization for capacity planning, what we've specified is that the jurisdiction for determining the amount of organic waste that's being disposed of can either use the latest waste characterization provided by the department. So the latest characterization provided by the department doesn't necessarily mean just the 2018 one. It would be if a subsequent one is updated later. Or if the jurisdiction has a more recent one that was performed within the county that includes the same categories of material, that could be substituted in lieu of using the department's study. So if in the case of 29 Palms, they feel that a more accurate representative study would be a local study that's done, we're comfortable with that being used, but not necessarily one from 1995 or 2000, right. Because the waste stream changes.
Okay, so if 2018 is now the threshold, we do one in 2019 or early 2020.
Sure.
Then it's not going to be supplanted by the next statewide characterization.
If there was another waste statewide characterization that was done, that would become the more recent waste characterization study.
And there's one plan, though, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so we shouldn't do one. To have a 3-month window
up to you.
of applicability.
So that would be the decision of the local government if they wanted to perform one or not, or to use the departments. But that would be a good issue to raise if there's a concern about the utility of doing one, if there's fear of it being supplanted within a few years for the capacity planning requirements. I would note, though, the capacity planning is not done every single year. It's done in 2022, and then I believe in 25, 2030. So I think that's an important consideration. And then on the procurement, again, good to submit comments on that. The intent of expanding the potential end uses that a jurisdiction could count towards the procurement target was partially designed to alleviate that concern that you're raising. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a real limit at some point as to how, if you're relying on giving it away and there's still no demand because there's little utility for it. And I think it relates to the earlier question about whether procurement means arranging to pay for the material or actually utilizing the material. So, maybe we don't need to define that, but I think, we might be able to arrange to purchase the material and then arrange for the use in some way, as you said, which might involve selling it to somebody who actually needs it. So.
It would be good to get that comment, 2 comments on that now. So if we need to provide clarity on that, we'll certainly look at that. But again, if you can submit that in writing in the comment period, so make sure we get it.
And thank you. I'm glad we're down to short strokes. Thanks.
It's all easy from here, right?
Michelle Leonard with SCS Engineers. John would be glad to do a waste characterization study for you. Just want to throw that out there. I just had a question on there's a new definition that was added on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And specifically, it says the analysis should include all stages of organic waste processing and distribution, including collection from a diversion location, waste processing, delivery, use of any finished material. So I guess I would like some clarification on some of those elements of the analysis, including so are we talking about transportation, GHG emissions from delivery, from collection, et cetera? We'll submit that in writing, but I just was curious on what the kind of the intent of that was and how broad that analysis would be.
Yeah, please do submit comments in writing on that. This was partially adapted in consultation with ARB from the life cycle language in low carbon fuel standard regulations. I am certainly not an expert on that regulatory package, but to the extent you have specific comments on this, you obviously do. It would be good to get that in writing because we'll have to sit down and kind of go through that with ARB.
Okay, thanks.
Chris, do we have other comments online? Why don't we do one more member from the audience, and then we'll jump to online comments again.
From Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works. Thank you for coming to Southern California again and presenting for us. I just wanted to take this opportunity to reiterate the importance of maximum flexibility with biosolids land application for the wastewater sector to be able to partner with the organics diversion. I understand within health and safety code requirements, but it is a very important issue for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, do you have comments online? And do you mind just, it's just about 2:45. How many comments do you have? Okay, let's do, those will be the last 4 online comments that we do, and then we'll come back to the audience before we close it up.
All right. Jennifer Gilbert, City of Davis. What about county fairs? They are not subject to the regulations on jurisdictions they are in, similar to schools. Do they fall under the same regulations as schools and universities?
The non-local entity definition does have a including but not limited to. If that's something we need to consider specifying in that, we'll have to take a look. I think generally county fairs are would kind of fall under that state agency area actually, or a large venue and event. Yeah, please do submit that comment in writing. Believe we have that covered under the non-local entity definition, but it would be good to get that comment so we can verify.
Okay. Kevin Barnes, Solid Waste Director, City of Bakersfield. Good job working out practical solutions. Can you please clarify the meaning of breakdown on page 8, line 43? Oh, we don't have that memorized. Also on page 8, line 35, does diversion location mean a generator's property?
Okay, so I think we'll have to take those if you can submit those comments in writing. I'm not sure can you say the second comment again?
So they're both page 8. The second one is line 35, does diversion location mean a generator's property?
Okay, I'm not seeing that on line 35 of page 8, but.
Okay. All right, and
Is that
last
line 25?
one, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll have to consult with the Air Resources Board on that one, so please do flag that comment. And then on the non-compostable paper, we will take another look at that definition if there's a comment on that.
And last one, Marissa Gann, Public Works, City of Livermore. If a separate agency purchases compost, for example, our separate and distinct park district or the school district, will that count towards the city's procurement goals?
The intent is to allow for that type of transaction to count, provided that the jurisdiction can demonstrate that the transaction took place at their behest, for lack of a better word. So it would be that in the context of a hauler, if the hauler is using RNG at the direction of the jurisdiction, so it would be similar for other entities.
That's it.
Okay, so it's 2:47. I think we have time for a couple more questions for clarification before we close out.
Colleen Foster, City of Oceanside. This question was presented before in earlier renditions, and I did notice you did edit part of the language, so I hope it still qualifies to address it. The rule still doesn't establish or clearly define what would be an acceptable physical space waiver. And so if I was a property management company or an owner of a business and my enclosure was built, probably not now, but 20 years ago, and the enclosure's only built for 1 or 2 bends, and my parking requires me to have a certain amount of parking, and I can't extend that enclosure space, do I qualify for a physical space waiver? And if so, probably over half my city would qualify for physical space de minimis waivers, which would make it very difficult for my agency to be able to fund a full organics collection system if I can't even bill half of my ratepayers.
Sure, thanks for the comment. One clarification in terms of folks are certainly free to comment on any piece. It's that to the extent a change was not made, we may not be providing a written response to a new comment, though if there was a comment during the 45-day comment period, we will be providing a response in the final rulemaking package.
But in this one, you did edit it. You actually, for the waivers, you originally required yearly reporting, so that kind of deferred people going after these waivers, but now you expanded the reporting to every 2 years. So it actually incentivizes businesses to go after these waivers and makes it very difficult for a jurisdiction to push back.
Okay. Again, so please do submit comments on this piece. I think the important clarification, and this is, I think, part of our discussion with this section to begin with, is that the jurisdiction is not obligated to provide these waivers. It will be at the discretion of the jurisdiction. So if the jurisdiction found that it was not economical to waive for physical space or for de minimis, they're not under an obligation to provide a service. They have the option to provide waivers under this section, but there's not an obligation for them to provide waivers.
Yeah, the difficulty, it makes the jurisdiction the bad guy when this regulation's been passed down by the state. The issue, though, with that is in the violations section, there is a section, my iPad died after reading it all night, but there is a section that states the jurisdiction can receive a penalty or fine if it does not grant waivers per this regulation. So I would be concerned if the jurisdiction pushed back on some of these waivers, the jurisdiction would be found guilty of not following the rule.
Sure. So please do comment on that section. The change to that penalty chart was to specify that if the jurisdiction issues waivers that are not consistent with the requirements, and the intent was if waivers were being issued without prior verification that a waiver was warranted. So we weren't, I can see where you're coming from. That wasn't our intent, but if you can provide that comment, that was more to actually restrict the amount of waivers that are issued by making sure there was potential penalties or fines if waivers were issued not in compliance or in exceeding what they're allowed to be. So if a de minimis waiver was issued and it wasn't warranted, there would be a potential penalty.
Thank you.
Are there additional questions before we close for today? Okay, Chris, anything else online? Okay, well, I do want to thank everyone for coming and providing questions. I do hope this was helpful in terms of clarifying some of the intent and the language that was posted yesterday. We will be sending out another notice on the listserv to just let folks know that the comment period remind folks that the comment period starts tomorrow. Again, the 15-day comment period runs from tomorrow through July 3rd, and we will be responding to formal comments that we receive in that period. To the extent those comments should be focused on the revised text. If you submitted a comment on text that wasn't revised, but you submitted a comment during the 45-day comment period, that will still be included. but we'll be providing those responses when we submit the final package. So again, the next step will be after the close of the comment period, we'll be providing a draft of the EIR and holding a public hearing for comments on that and announcing the comment period for that. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation and your questions, and hope this was helpful.